Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Man vs. Mob. It's been a while, and I just recently came back from a second part of a rather long road trip. This one was shorter, it was 2 weeks, but it's good to be back. And I really don't want to go traveling in a car for a while because it's a lot of sitting. But this one was to Appalachia and the Deep South. And the reason that I went on this one was because on the last trip I missed those regions and I had really wanted to go visit them, but I had really rocketed up through the East Coast so that I could get to Manhattan for September 11th. And I was feeling guilty when I got back that I had pretty much skipped a large region that I had wanted to go visit. And that's why in the recent months, I would say since pretty much August, I've been rather inconsistent with these podcast episodes, although I do have two episodes before this one author Gerald Posner about the Kennedy assassination, which I highly recommend you listen to, and one with one of my good friends, Gray, who came in and we spoke about a lot of different things, particularly a hopeful generational shift away from kind of the grifting stereotype of succeeding through climbing over other people and screwing them over, and more towards an earnest authenticity and collaborating and helping each other achieve and find meaning and create. So that's another great episode. Um, I guess with this one, I'm going to go into some of the details of what I was trying to do and what I saw in Appalachia in the Deep South. And then I'll have another episode about something else entirely as sort of a supplement to this one. So, one of the main things that I wanted to do in Appalachia and the Deep South was to humanize the Trump voter. And that is a pretty tall order for a lot of people, but over the last couple years, over the last 5 years, I would say, there has been this increasing view that one side of the political aisle is stupid, evil, completely out of touch. And what I was trying to do here was to show people, particularly who live in the areas um, that I grew up, like coastal cities in particular on the East and the West Coast. I was trying to really send images of what I was seeing, images and little videos back, and to sort of pop the bubble, so to speak, of the experiences that are lived in these coastal cities. First of all, there's a difference between what's seen in the North and the South. Second of all, there's a difference between what's seen in urban and rural areas. And a lot of people, I've talked about this before, a lot of people, they live their lives basically in or around a major city, and they haven't really ventured outside, maybe 15 to 20 minutes outside of their own major city. They have lived their lives going city to city. They fly to other places across the country, other major coastal cities. They stay in suburbs around the major cities. And when they travel internationally, they go to places that are basically culturally identical. Um, in the grand scheme of things, there might be different cuisines and dances and whatnot, but the sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of different places isn't really seen to its full extent. So um, there's definitely a bubble, and I was hoping uh, to show things outside of the bubble, while also being cautious not to create a distortion of what is outside of the bubble. For example, when I was seeing on the previous trip, when I was seeing homelessness, there's definitely an increase in homelessness that you see, particularly because of COVID. But um, I didn't want to take only pictures of homelessness, because that would imply that that is the only thing going on, or that it's way more of an issue than it actually is. I want to present these things as, hey, these are something that we should not ignore, not look away from, but they're not all of reality. It's the same thing with instances of prejudice. As I've mentioned, I think I mentioned this a couple podcasts ago when I was going over the previous trip, is if you were to focus on instances of prejudice and go around filming what you see, flipping over rocks, looking for it, then you would have a distorted view of reality. So, um, with this trip, I went to McDowell County in West Virginia, which is the poorest county in one of the poorest states. It's basically coal country. And I met some very friendly people. I saw firsthand the struggling that goes on in some of these rural areas that are particularly invested in um, the industrial economy. So you think about energy production for industry, whether it's coal, in the past it's been coal, or oil, more recently natural gas, but the fossil fuels. You think about farming practices, big factory farms, things like that. These are things that we're trying to change today. But I think that with our lofty ambitions, which we should have lofty ambitions, we're not really realizing the effects that these changes have on places that aren't immediately nearby. And if we don't know people outside of our bubble, then we think that nobody is negatively affected by this. And when there's political ramifications like support for Donald Trump that seems to spring out of nowhere, um, it didn't spring out of nowhere. And I'm hoping that some degree of reflection took place over the last 4 years as to where the Trump presidency came from. And by the way, I'm recording this right now on election day 2020. So, we don't know what the next 4 years is going to have in store. But if it's a second Trump presidency, if it's a second term, I think we need to be a bit more introspective rather than just, um, you know, casting blame, pointing fingers at each other, saying you're responsible for this. There are bigger things going on in the background that if we don't pay attention to, it's to our own peril. And this is actually going to bleed into the second episode that I am going to do, which is more about the new media environment and the slow media movement. Um, so aside from McDowell County, and I stopped at a vegetable stand in McDowell County and had a conversation with, it was a mother and a daughter, and the father was in the background, but it looked like a whole family ran the stand. And they were saying, "Oh, you don't sound like a northerner. You don't come across like a northerner." And I took it as a compliment, but I didn't know exactly what they meant. I kind of poked fun at it with them. I said, was I supposed to sound like a Matt Damon or Ben Affleck or Mark Wahlberg movie, or was I supposed to come across as just totally arrogant, like I just came from Harvard or MIT or something like that. Um, the kind of Ivy League stereotypes. So I don't know what they meant by it, but I thought that was interesting. And from there, I got as far south as Houston, Texas, far south and west as Houston, Texas, I should say. Actually, as far west, because I did go to the Florida Keys also. Um, and in Houston, the two major things that I saw, aside from visiting a friend from the Andrew Yang campaign some months back in Iowa, I saw the energy sector that exists over there with oil and natural gas, which is just, if you think about LA as the entertainment capital, and you think about San Francisco as the technology capital of Silicon Valley, and you think about Boston as the education capital, and DC as the political capital, and New York as the cultural and financial capital, then Houston is the energy capital. And there are so many oil refineries around Houston that is another thing people don't realize is, if you're from any one of those other cities and somebody said, we need to transition away from the thing that is the lifeblood of your economy, and they didn't really have a clear path towards your local economy shifting over to something new, then you'd say, no, screw you. I'm not, this is our entire local commerce, our entire local industry. So getting rid of it is going to cripple us. That's what we don't realize. Um, Aside from that, seeing the Space Center, the Johnson Space Center in Houston, was actually really cool, because not only were there NASA rockets and models of some of the old shuttles, but there was also a SpaceX rocket there. So it was cool to see the merging of the public and private space exploration slash industries. Um, After Houston, I went along the Gulf Coast, actually visited some former sugarcane plantations. One of them was actually featured in the movie Django Unchained with you'll I don't know if you've seen the movie or if you remember it, but there were two staircases, curved staircases going down to either side. And it's the plantation where Django comes in the first time riding on his horse, and everybody is shocked to see a black man riding on a horse. But I saw that plantation, and I went to a couple other plantations, and it was very interesting because, first of all, people are super friendly. They're super. The people who worked at the plantations I'm talking about, super friendly, super respectful of the legacy, and also very thoughtful of the various um, morally complex questions surrounding the plantation system and the history of slavery and whatnot. So I was really glad that these buildings were actually preserved, both the main houses and the slave cabins as well. But these were sugarcane plantations. I actually didn't get to visit any uh, cotton plantations because those are a little bit further north. Pretty much all you can grow in the swampy, very wet areas is sugarcane. You can't grow cotton there. However, I did actually, when I was pulling over to the side of the road at one point, I stopped at a cotton field and I actually picked a, a couple pieces of cotton. It was really interesting. I'd never seen cotton in a field before, but it looks insane. It's a very snowy looking field with white everywhere, and um, it was so I brought a couple pieces of cotton home with me. Um, so after after the sugarcane plantations, which were primarily near New Orleans, there are a bunch of cotton plantations also near Natchez, Mississippi, which I think is probably one of the higher concentrations of existing plantations today. After these plantations in New Orleans, I actually visited the lower Ninth Ward, which is the worst hit neighborhood of where Katrina made ground in 2005, I believe. And it's still pretty rough. There are still houses that are just completely caved in, and neighborhoods that are really rough looking. It didn't help that I arrived when it was raining, but man, it was really eye opening to see some of these local residences that 15 years later are still abandoned, decrepit, decayed. Some of them are empty lots. Some of them are just collapsed houses. You see drug addiction, strange behavior from drug addiction. Like there was a guy near a gas station. His wife was in the car. He was outside of the car. He was selling bags of Tide laundry detergent and kind of holding them in the air like he was a huckster or something. Like people are going to come running for, you know, bootleg or second market laundry detergent. And I actually went inside of a couple residences, and there was also an old, what looked like maybe it was a daycare or an elementary school or something like that, and they were falling apart. And so I just walked. Pardon me. I walked through filming, and I hadn't walked through before I turned the camera on, so I didn't really even know what I was going to walk into. But this daycare or elementary school was particularly wild in that there were many, many needles in the area that was the transition from kind of the back wall to the patio slash playground area. There were, at first I didn't see them because I was looking in a broader sense at the whole building. And then as I walked into that area, I saw these orange caps and all of these uh, empty needles everywhere. There was dozens and dozens of needles. It was pretty insane to actually see it up close. I got some photos of with some needles in the foreground and the collapsing building sort of in the background. And yeah, a lot of photos, like I said, some of which are gritty, but the good, the bad, and the ugly of all these different areas. And I think it's important that you see all of that, because otherwise you get a very distorted view of the world, of the state of these different areas. There's a lot of it is good people going through really bad times as we shift to a technological economy, and we have all these new opportunities and different industries that differ from the past 100 years with the industrial economy. But that transition doesn't go over as well in the areas that are so heavily invested in the old economy. It's the same thing that happened during the Civil War, where there was the agricultural economy of the South and the emerging industrial economy of the North. And there was this imposition of a new way of life and a new economy when the North won the Civil War. But there was a lot of hard feelings. And I would say that the Reconstruction was rather half baked. And what ended up happening was one half of the country was kind of frozen, as I've said before, like a mosquito in amber, in this state of semi-transition, or largely still with the infrastructure of the past economy, and no help in earnest, because there were a lot of opportunists, there were a lot of carpetbaggers, people coming from the north to take advantage of the Reconstruction effort. There was a lot of Southern resentment. There was a lot of Northern um, arrogance, and so I think that we really need to. One of the major reasons why I went on this trip is to have a smoother transition this time that really brings the full country forward, rather than just half of the country and leaving the rest with the industrial wasteland and the investment and the debt of the industrial economy, and having to, so sorry, that's your problem, even though the people in the coastal cities rely on those industrial goods in the finished goods that they consume. They don't see the firsthand necessarily of who's working in those factories, who's working on those farms, who is um, building their family and their community and um, their vocation around tho- those industries continuing to exist. So after I left the lower Ninth Ward, I traveled through lower Mississippi, lower Alabama, went down around the perimeter of Florida, all the way to the Florida Keys, to Key West, which was pretty interesting. I'd never been there before. There was a surprising amount of Trump support in Florida. And I will say that in general, there was way more enthusiasm for Donald Trump as a candidate, visible enthusiasm. I'm talking like pep rallies and signs being hung up, and banners being flown, and groups of trucks driving around with the flags billowing out the back. There was far more of that than I didn't honestly see. The only semi enthusiasm that I saw from on behalf of Biden was in Clearwater, Florida, and that was just a couple people on the side of the road, sort of handing out flyers, I guess, but they weren't really. It wasn't like that pep rally vibe of enthusiasm, people clanging cowbells and cheering and whatnot. And I don't know how much of this is distorted by the fact that Trump people have tended to disregard the COVID restrictions more than Biden people, so they're more willing to actually meet up in these larger groups. So I don't know how much of it is distorted by that, and how much of it is actually reflective of the greater enthusiasm and potential turnout at the polls. So um, I will say that any encounter that I did have with Trump supporters in these various areas, they were extremely friendly. Um, they were willing to talk. They were willing to explain. And even when I said I was from up near Boston, there was no prejudice towards me or anything like that. So it was, overall a good experience with the various people that I had. Um, so the reason that I visited Clearwater, and this is unrelated to politics directly, I would say, is Clearwater, Florida is the headquarters of Scientology. And this is something that I've been interested in for a long time. Cults, scams, mind control, those different topics and how they interrelate to each other. And it was really kind of spooky to see how much property Scientology owns in downtown Clearwater. And earlier in my trip, I'd been listening on the car speakers to on Spotify the podcast Scientology Fair Game with Mike Rinder and Leah Remini, who were both ex-Scientologists. If you have ever seen the show The King of Queens, then you actually know Leah Remini. She's the wife. I believe her name was Carrie in the show. So sort of the Queen's accent, and she was quite funny, and she's quite funny in the podcast as well. But sort of that no bullshit attitude, and so the two of them are basically calling Scientology to task and saying how corrupt it is as an institution, how it takes advantage of people, how it takes advantage of people's labor. It's basically running what are akin to slave labor practices, how it divides families, and when somebody says they're going to leave Scientology or try to discredit it in some way, they not only launch a campaign to entirely smear that person, they launched litigation to destroy the person financially. And also, if the person has a family that's also a member of Scientology, they tell the family to cut ties with them entirely, and they label that person an SP, which is a suppressive person. So I've wondered for a while why exactly it is that the government hasn't done anything about Scientology, because it's effectively the largest um, official tax exempt, legally recognized. It's called a religion, but it really is a cult in how it practices. Why nobody's done anything about this legally? And first of all, I think it's important to ask, well, what is a cult? This is a question that I've dealt with before in a previous episode where I had Stephen Hassan on, who's a cult expert, and he was formerly a member of the Moonies cult. And he talks about undue influence, which is influence against somebody's will or against their knowledge. So he has a model called the BITE model, which is behavioral, informational, um, emotional is E. I don't remember what T was, but there were these four forms of control, and if the organization uses those forms of control to isolate the individual, then it is a cult. If it's just a regular organization, religious or otherwise, that allows people free expression and free involvement with other people outside of the organization, where they can discuss and compare ideas and talk about, and they don't really care about trying to control or manipulate the person, then it's not a cult. And by the way, these situations exist in individual relationships too, where you have a controlling partner. So um, I started to look into, or I started to talk with Stephen Hassan about why it might be that Scientology has this 501c3 tax exemption and nothing has been done about it. It doesn't pay any taxes to downtown Clearwater, even though Scientology claims that they revitalized Clearwater and that they're an essential part of the community. They're actually very secretive, and they own a lot of the businesses downtown, but it's not necessarily clearly labeled that they own those businesses. But they get into local politics, and they uh, use a lot of intimidation practices to get people onto their side. And so Stephen and I were talking about this, and we were speculating that one of the reasons might be that the government, particularly if you want to call it the intelligence gathering or social security apparatus of the government, the CIA, the FBI, whatever. The CIA has a history of attempting something similar, mind control and undue influence on American citizens through its MK Ultra program, which was revealed back in the 70s, where they were trying to use hallucinogenic drugs to see if they could implant thoughts and impulses into people's heads that they wouldn't otherwise have. So they were trying to see if they could create covert agents, almost like Manchurian candidates, where they could plant something in their head and then have them deliver it over some long distance and have it be retrieved at the other end without them even knowing it. They were trying to see if they could get people to act against their own consciences, their own values, ethics. They were trying to see if they could effectively control people's minds. And there are some famous cases of this that are known. Ken Kesey, the guy who was an author who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, actually was a part of the MK Ultra experiments. Whitey Bulger was part of the MK Ultra experiments. He was experimented on when he was in prison. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was part of the MK Ultra experiments. And there's also a book out recently called Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, where author Tom O'Neill talks about how Charles Manson was likely involved and was experimented on as part of MK Ultra. And MK Ultra was conducted through prisons. It was conducted through through colleges and universities, through hospitals, through mental health facilities, through anywhere where there was a captive audience, or maybe an audience that was overly trusting, or an audience that wouldn't be believed if they went in and talked about this to someone. So it was a pretty big web, and the argument was that that Charles Manson might have gotten involved when his parole officer sent him to Haight-Ashbury, and there was a clinic there that was run by an MK Ultra experimenter, Jolly West. So I'm not going to get too much further into the dirt here, but I will say that there is suspicion that I have that one of the reasons why the government doesn't go after, first of all, Scientology and other cults and scams more in earnest, and second of all, why it doesn't go after some of the attempts that Silicon Valley is using to manipulate people and get them addicted to various forms of technology and scrolls and social media, is because they themselves are guilty of doing this, and they don't want to draw attention to that, because it would be easy for someone who's accused of this to turn around and say, well, you yourself are also doing that. So anyway, this is all related to Clearwater. So if you're interested in any of that, I have plenty of recommendations about content surrounding Scientology. There's a book by David Miscavige, the current leader of Scientology. His father, Ron Miscavige, wrote a book called Ruthless. And then there's also Going Clear, which is an HBO documentary featuring former Scientologists. There's the Scientology Fair Game podcast, which I mentioned before. And then there's also Louis Theroux's My Scientology Movie, which is very entertaining and pretty creepy at the same time. So there's a lot of content surrounding this. I did visit the church headquarters, and I walked in and I got some literature and talked with the lady at the desk for a little while. One thing that was interesting is I tried to buy a copy of Dianetics, which is L. Ron Hubbard's main self-help book. It's kind of like the Scientology Bible. And I was told that I would have to log in and basically purchase it as a donation to Scientology, which was a shady way of them basically manipulating tax exemption status and not collecting actual income, but collecting donations. So very interesting stuff. Anyway, after all that, I basically went back through up the East Coast, and the last several interesting places that I visited, I wanted to visit a bunch of historic fields, and I visited. The first one was the Flight 93 Memorial, which was near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The second one was Gettysburg, which is, of course, that really awful, bloody Civil War battle. And that was also in Pennsylvania. Then I visited Woodstock, which is in Bethel Woods, New York. And there's not much there anymore. There's a marker to the site, but it was really cool to see that. And then the last place that I visited was Lexington and Concord, which is in my backyard, basically. But I think that seeing the former sites of these different places and what went on there, and thinking about whether it's the violence or the peace or what they're known for, is, if we think about it, we can reflect on the things, the locations that we're at right now, and what future generations are going to see embodied in those locations. The decisions that we make right now during this time of crisis, are they going to be decisions of war and violence, or are they going to be decisions of peace and turning towards evolution instead of revolution? Um, I suppose that's all I really have to say about this particular leg of the trip. Like I said, I'm hoping that I don't need to go traveling for a while, in a car at least. And I'm going to try to incorporate some type of sponsor. Well, these aren't official sponsors. I should say some type of product that I enjoy into these podcasts from now on, with the hopes of over time gathering sponsors. But this time it relates directly to the trip that I was on. So dude wipes are actually awesome. And if you don't know what they are, it's basically like baby wipes, but they're biodegradable and they're marketed more towards men, because a lot of men are like, well, I'm not going to use baby wipes. So you call them dude wipes. They become more palatable. And these ones in particular, they're first of all, they're flushable wipes, but you can also, if you're out in the middle of nowhere, like I was a lot of the trip, and you got to go to the bathroom, you can pull over and find somewhere to squat and use these, and you can just kind of like bury them, or tuck them away somewhere, and not worry that they're just going to sit there forever and never biodegrade. So they're not made from plastic fibers. It says here that they're plant sourced fibers, and they're extra large wipes. These ones are mint chill, and I picked these ones up at Walmart before I left, but you can generally find them at like, a CVS or a Walgreens or someplace like that. But I really like them. They're reliable. They don't tear. It's quality. It's not like, a thin ply toilet paper or anything like that. And it's not just for going to the bathroom. It's also for, um, maybe I should admit this, but there were several times over the trip where I wasn't showering for a day or two. And if you don't have deodorant, you can kind of use them in other places of your body too, your armpits, and it smells good, and there's no it's not rough on your skin, doesn't burn, doesn't leave a rash, at least for me. And I have somewhat sensitive skin, so dude wipes, check them out, and you can find them pretty much anywhere where you go shopping, anywhere near you. That's all for today, and see you soon.